Welcome to the Dear Dyslexic podcast, where lived experience meets real conversation. We shine a light on the stories that need to be heard, with honest and inspiring conversations with people with dyslexia and other neurodivergent conditions like dyscalculia, dysgraphia, ADHD, and autism. The Dear Dyslexic podcast is more than just a show. It's a community, a space for connection, and a movement to rethink dyslexia. Subscribe today and join us on our journey, one story at a time.
So, moving on then to strategies. What are some of the things that have helped you? And then we will transition into what you've seen help people and then what makes psychosocial safety in the workplace. I think we've gone about it in a different way than when I'd started, but let's try that way first.
Let's try that way first. Well, look, for me and the teams that I've led, what works best is understanding your condition, understanding what works well for you, understanding your team. So, in my work life and experience, I've been fortunate enough to have a lot of personnel and management training with large financial institutions or superannuation institutions. I've undertaken both for myself and my teams, Gartner testing, Myers-Briggs testing, Clifton Strengths testing, and also emotional intelligence testing. And so I think with understanding yourself better, understanding your teams better, understanding how people communicate, work together, and how they think helps you as a leader then to have conversations with people about what are their needs and to set up what I call psychologically safe work environments. So what I tend to do when I talk about strategies for myself and my team is look at reinforcing positive messaging and positive behaviors for great leadership so that you're creating an environment where people can speak up and feel safe psychologically to speak up and have conversations. So what are some of the things that I do? I talk about myself and my own situation, which then gives people permission to talk about their situation. And the natural behavior for people in building rapport is to self-disclose. Now, if you have a psychologically safe environment where you have created an environment of no judgment, no bullying or toxic behavior, of acceptance and inclusion, then people will feel safer in order to speak up and have those conversations. And I believe it's incumbent on leadership to create that environment or know how to create that environment through training in the workforce.
And so when you think about those words, psychosocial hazards in the workplace or creating psychologically safe environments, what do they mean for you?
Yeah, a great question, Shay. And I suppose we'll take a step back to what are the key factors of creating a psychologically safe environment. And there are a number, and of course you can Google it or look it up on AI, ChatGPT. But for me, over my experience, I would say that there are three key factors of creating a psychologically safe environment for neurodiverse people or people with dyslexia. And the first is great leadership. The second is job design and job demand. And the three is environmental factors. So let's unpack some of those, what they mean, and then perhaps talk to some specific examples that I've seen in the workforce about how we can address those things. So for me, in great leadership, it's about having consistent communication. It's about disabling toxic and bullying environments. So creating environments in the workplace where we come together as a team to make decisions collaboratively and not judgments. So, for example, I was working in a large superannuation organisation during COVID, managing a team of 8 completely remotely. And before we would start our online meetings, we would have the usual chit chat, warming up, get to know you. And often what would come into those conversations was the latest television program that we might be watching. And at the time, there was one on married. I'm not going to marriage, and I'm not going to say the brand name here. But I think we all know that one. And it became a little bit of a judgmental conversation about that. Now, as a leader, whilst that was a social conversation, I felt it my responsibility to say, hey, we're not here to judge or let me say, bitch about people. We're here to talk about positive experiences. So, what's some of the positive experiences we've had this week? And I think that then sets a tone as a leader of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable by creating an environment that is non judgmental and that we're coming here today to talk about decisions. So, one of the other things that I did there too was to ensure that all of our meetings weren't just task focused, that we actually came together as a group online during COVID socially and set up, an online breakfast club, an online coffee club, where we'd actually drop in and imaginally buy our coffee for the morning before heading into work, where we could have those social gathering moments and reinforce those messages of a positively safe psychological environment. So,
So, sorry to stop you there for a minute, Ben. Can you just explain what those words mean in case people haven't heard them yet?
yeah, so for me, a psychologically safe environment is one where people feel safe to speak up, where there won't be any retaliation, there won't be any judgment, they won't be shut down, where they feel comfortable in having hard conversations, difficult conversations, and speaking about what their needs are, regardless of whether they're workplace needs or personal needs.
Thank you. Just in case people have heard the term, but they weren't quite sure. And even though we're doing a whole heap of work on it, none of that's out yet. This will be our taster. So thank you for just explaining that, just in case people were wondering and they hadn't Googled because they were too busy listening to you. So sorry. So you were talking about, and that was a really great example of the coffee and coming together to have a chat. So what else have you seen that's worked well while you've been in leadership roles or
Yeah,
continue to
look,
be?
I think that's the second part that I was talking about is job design and job demand. And a really great example there. And what I mean by that is really it's upon leadership to manage excessive workflow and emotional demands on the workforce. Now, yes, we work in a fast-paced environment, an ever-changing environment. It's more fluid than ever before. There is more information than ever before. In marketing terms, we would say that we have over 1 million stimuli around brand messaging throughout the day. There is now research out from universities to say, and I believe it was Cambridge, to say that the teenage brain, in terms of adult development, has 5 stages: 0 to 9, 9 to 33, 33 to 56, and 56 to 83, I believe, from memory. And that teenage year has grown from 9 to 25 and is the biggest, or adolescent year is the biggest year, now spanning into our 30s because of the information overload on people. So it's really important that as leaders we understand that and we manage it for our teams. One of the examples that I'd like to speak to is having worked with local government. And I think that there's a perception that in government or large organizations, you've got time and resources. But regardless of whether you're in a small business or a scale up business or a mid sized business, I think if you take the time to understand your team, understand how they communicate, whether they're auditory, verbal, how they think, whether they're scientific brains, whether they're directed brains, whether they're people that come together and rally the team, whether they are client based people. Understanding how teams interact and communicate well is just best practice, not just only for neurodiverse people or people with dyslexia. So when I worked for this local council, my role there, or the remit, was to review and audit and update the public infringement appeals process. And that required working with local laws officers out on the street. That required working with a telecommunications or a telemarketing team, a customer service team of about 20. That required working with a frontline reception team of about 13, as well as a leadership team. And so I actually said to the leaders, first thing that I will do is actually nothing. I want to spend time with each of these teams and get to know what their workflow is, what their work processes are, and who they are as individuals and as a team. So don't expect any results from me for 3 months. Now, as a small scale up, you might, or a small business, you might have to readjust your expectations around what will work in your business. But for local council, that worked well. So we had workshops, we had town halls, we had forums, we had meetings whereby I got to know all of the teams. I undertook some behavioural studies into the teams and some surveys and some questions, both qualitative and quantitative, as well as face-to-face interviews and informal interviews. Then I was able to gather all of that information. We talked about job design and job process and what would make the jobs better in terms of automation, in terms of communication, in terms of procedure and structure. And each of these teams had input into the process or had representatives providing and channeling feedback into a pool of information. And then as a leadership team, we came together and worked out what information was going to work for the business and what job redesign would work and what wouldn't work. And then we clearly communicated our actionable items back to the workforce about that, which was critical to say, this is what we've heard from you, this is what we're taking on board, and this is what we're not taking on board, and these are the reasons for both. And then providing avenues for communication and channel and feedback to redesign that process. So it was iterative, as we would say in the tech world. It wasn't waterfall. And then we would pilot those changes, and then we would re-engineer those changes to see, was that actually really working in practice for the teams? And so in summary, what we did, Shay, was review the appeals process from 23 manually written processes and letters down to 11 automated systems.
Wow, that's amazing. And so throughout that journey, do you think by doing it iteratively and by being so inclusive, it sounds like from everyone within those different teams, that in itself was a way of creating that psychological safety because everyone was involved, everyone had input, it was a pilot, so you could go back and forth and trial and test, and no one was wrong, no one was right. It was developing in time.
Absolutely. And, key to that was establishing the environmental factors and the psychosocial factors around how we would engage. So, establishing at the top of each meeting how we would communicate with each other, how we would respect each other, what was expected during the meeting in terms of outcomes, what was expected in terms of the way we would collaboratively engage with one another. What were the aims, and what were importantly, using De Bono's 6 hats, what were the emotions that people were feeling? How did they feel going into the process? How did they feel during the process? And how did they feel at the end of the process? Really critical to marry those things together in my mind for the success of the program.
And so before we go on to what we generally see for neurodivergent people, what you had one more key factor that we wanted to share?
Yeah, which was a really good segue into how does it work for neurodiverse people, and that is the environmental factors. So really, again, people from neurodiverse backgrounds may or may not be diagnosed. And as a leader, it's your responsibility, or the organiser's responsibility, to empower and train you to identify what the needs are of your workforce, or to set up environments where people feel safe to have those conversations with you. So again, what I do is I talk about my own experience, which opens the door for people. I often will have conversations with people outside the workplace. Let's go for a coffee. Let's go for a walk around the park. Tell me what you need from your job. Tell me what you need from me, and tell me how we can achieve that together. This is and calling out that this is a safe environment. What we discuss here today will be kept confidential if you would like it to be kept confidential. So some of the things that work for me and that work for my team is to ensure that the lighting is appropriate, to ensure that the sound is appropriate, to ensure that there aren't triggers around smell and possibly even taste in the work environment, and to call out those things. For myself, I like to change the color of my screen in Microsoft Word, so that I'm not looking at a glaringly white screen. I have indirect lighting around me all the time rather than fluorescent lighting. It's not always been the case. It can change a lot of environmental factors in the workforce, but as a leader, you would want to be able to have some influence over that for your workforce. And now that we work in an environment where work is a time, not necessarily a place, we would instill things like what I call adult to adult relationships. So there's no set times to start and finish work in contracts. You and I are both working from home offices at the moment. So there may be anchor days at which people go into a workplace, which I think it's really important. As an environmental factor for people from neurodiverse backgrounds, they need that stimulation often of being around other people and that challenge of being around other people. Isolation can be a challenge, but at the same time, it can be too overwhelming for some people from neurodiverse backgrounds to have a lot of stimulation around them. So it's about having the conversation with people, what works for them.
So, from a neurodivergent perspective, because everyone's at risk of having a psychologically unsafe work environment, um, and I mean, which is why they brought all the new guidelines and mandates in at the moment. But what do you see are the differentiating points for neurodivergent people? And so I did my thesis on the job demands resource model of burnout and looking at it from a dyslexic perspective. But from your perspective as a leader, what have you seen that can be trip hazards? I mean, we've just talked about the environment, but are there other has there ever been a situation for you where you've been at work and you felt vulnerable or unsafe because of your dyslexia and you didn't want to talk about it, or you were made to feel a certain way because of it? Because I've got lots of stories I could share, but I want to hear from you.
Well, look, there's a couple of things that I'd like to mention. First, around job demand and clarity of job role, and then an example of working and leading a person who disclosed a diagnosis of autism to me. And so the first thing is around job role and job description. It's really important often for people with neurodivergent backgrounds that they have clear, defined guardrails around what are the expectations in their position description and job role. And if that is going to change, and it may need to on a day-to-day basis, the role may be flexible, that there is a conversation had with them about that changing expectation and that job role, and that is come to in an agreed manner, so that they don't feel like, oh, I've applied for this job, I've accepted this job, but it's actually shifted your expectations and change, and it's outside of my ability, or I feel like I'm overwhelmed by that change. I probably can handle that change, but I will need to handle that changing incrementally. And I think it's incumbent on the leader to have that conversation and to work through that job design. Now, in a small business or a scale up, even in large businesses, the job can change frequently. The job demand can change frequently. There may be, for example, in a large financial institutions, you may have a team where you have internal stakeholders. In a workforce of 55,000, you might have 150 to 200 different stakeholders. And you may be requiring people with neurodiverse backgrounds to be part of teams that are supporting those internal stakeholders. So what supports do they need outside of environmental factors? But are there psychologically psychological support such as EAP programs? Are there AI programs? Are there technical programs that can assist them that they would require, or that you could talk to them about using that will help them in their workplace? The example that I'd like to talk to in managing an autistic person who disclosed to me that they had autism, it was very clear to me with my experience that they were presenting with factors or indicators of autism. In my personal life, I had also dated someone with autism, so it was glaringly obvious to me. What I found is that they had been seated in an open plan office and near an entry exit doorway, both outside to a balcony where people would go out and socialize or have lunch, and also in a hallway that would enter into the open workspace area. Now, they enjoyed being part of that environment because there was lots of stimulation for them, and part of their autism was ADHD as well. And so for them, there was something always going on that was stimulating them. As a leader, what I was finding is their work was being impacted in the sense that they were not completing tasks, they were not meeting deadlines, and they were also in completing a task, not going through all the steps that were required in meeting that task. So, for example, organising for marketing collateral to be sent for a conference, ordering the couriers, checking on the status of the couriers and the delivery of the materials wasn't for taking place in a systematic way to ensure the goods got from point A to point B. And in some cases, we didn't even get the materials to the conference for our sales team at the exhibition stands. So it was critical for me to identify that, have a conversation, and I suggested that we move the team, the whole team, not just the person with autism, into my office, which was secluded in a leadership area, and I was happy to go and sit out in the open plan office area.
And so, how did that work? Because in a lot of ways, because when we run training, we get this question all the time: what is a reasonable adjustment and what becomes unreasonable? And how do you identify when it's a neurodivergent, something because of their neurodivergence, where they're not meeting expectations because of the example here around the environment, versus you've done all those adjustments, but they're still not meeting expectation. How have you worked through that in the past? Is that did I make myself clear then?
Yeah, I think if I relay the question, it's about, well, one, how do you not single out one person or group of peoples around neurodivergence? And then if you do make those adjustments and there is no change, how do you manage through that? So the first thing that I would say, as I said earlier, I think a lot of what we're talking about is, whilst it's a new discussion around neurodivergence in the workplace, it reminds me of the conversations around bullying, around sexual harassment, around gender identity, around sexual orientation. They're now part of the course when it comes to best practice employee management of employees. I think that what we're talking about today, whilst it is new to the workforce, is really about best practice. So it's about engaging the whole workforce, not calling out a single person, but as a leader, being aware of the needs of neurodiverse people, having one-on-one confidential conversations, and so that you can take those insights into the broader team discussion about the wider redesign or redesign of either environmental factors or job descriptions, so that you can talk as a team rather than individuals, or you can talk about roles rather than individuals. How do you manage that then? Uh, your typical leadership, people management principles, have clear, open discussions, set reasonable expectations, have a lead with agreement and consensus rather than a dictatorial top-down approach, have regular work in progress meetings, regular check-in meetings, day to day, week to week, month to month, whatever frequency works for you and the organization, so that people are not blindsided by your expectations as a leader or the organization's expectations not being met. And of course, having KPIs in place, which is critical to laddering up to the corporate plan and corporate strategy.
And so when you think about neurodivergence then and putting some of those additional strategies in place. Sorry, I have to pause because I had a really important point and I was going to ask you as you were talking. We'll have to cut this bit out, John, which is never normally happens. It was around not so much performance management, but not job design. Gosh, my whole brain just stopped.
KPIs,
No, it was before that because I was
bullying,
thinking it in out of my head.
sexual orientation.
No, it was after that, and you were talking about
Not singling out people.
out. God, I'm sorry, my brain just completely stopped. Hopefully it comes back to me. Okay, let's just pick it back up to, so your last sentence was around best practice.
Mm-hmm. Setting KPIs that ladder up to the corporate plan and corporate structure.
Oh my God, my brain just stopped completely. I was so interested in what you were talking about.
Well, let me go on to talk about a question that you asked for me, and how have things impacted me in the workplace. So I would say that I have built into my workplace and my work practices extra time. So I need extra time to be able to proofread. I need extra time to be able to use spell checkers and grammar checkers, and I now put most things through ChatGPT or Claude, as in AI, to assist me, so that when leaders come to me or internal or clients come to me either internally or through my consultancy and say, this is the timeline and the deadline that we are setting, I then will have, as in most workplaces, a conversation about meeting those deadlines and what's realistic, building into that the factors of what I need and what my teams need in order to meet those deadlines. Now, if those deadlines are not achievable, given the time restraints that we require in terms of getting our work done in an appropriate fashion, so that it is perfect or as good as perfect can be before going out publicly or to the client, then we will have a discussion about what needs to be dropped off. So that comes to my point earlier about managing emotional and excessive job demand. As a leader, that's your responsibility.
If you haven't done so already, make sure you sign up to our mailing list so you can keep up to date with everything we are doing at Rethink Dyslexia. So head to rethinkdyslexia.com.au. And don't forget, if there's anything you heard today that was distressing, you can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36. Thanks for listening and bye for now.